Hello, my name is Jacob Monk. The last 500 years there's been a lot of Protestant propaganda in the medias in the Northern Europe, including in Scandinavia where I'm living. Well, most Danes, most Scandinavians, they know Martin Luther, but they don't know the real Martin Luther. They have an absolutely false picture of who was this person, Martin Luther. They don't know anything about his mental diseases. They don't know anything about his alcohol problems. They don't know anything about he hanged himself, and that is the way he ended his life. They see him as a healthy, young German man with light hair, living a joyous life and having a lot of friends and a lot of female followers. They see him as some kind of theological pop idol. But the reality is that Martin Luther was a very sick person. From when he was young, he had several mental diseases, schizophrenia, depression and others. That is the reason why he became monk, because he had met some devil out on a cornfield someday when there was thunder weather, and to avoid the lightning he prayed and prayed, I don't want to be killed by the lightning. If I'm not killed, I will be a monk, I'll go in a monastery. Well, he believed it was the devil who created this lightning and all the thunder. So therefore he prayed to the devil. And he was saved. Actually, he didn't die, as you know. He lived a long life. He was born in 1483 and he lived until 1546. Yes, but in 1517 he published his famous thesis he put up on the church door in Wittenberg. And there he said a lot of things that was partly self-contradictory. And from there it developed. A few years later he published his infamous book about the non-free will of human beings. Everything is evil. This world is run by Satan. God is only existing in the kingdom of heaven. You will meet him when Christ comes back, and when that will happen, no one knows. Well, most of the films, I would say all the films I've seen made in America and Germany about Martin Luther, they are falsifications of the real Martin Luther. And 99% of the books published in Europe and USA, they are falsifications too. But I have two books here, being non-falsifications. I'll recommend both of them to you. One is very interesting. It's written by a Danish psychiatrist called, he was a doctor at our public hospital here in Copenhagen. He was called Paul J. Reiter. Well, this man, he was very hard-working as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, but also as a biographer of Luther. And he combined the development of the Lutheran theology with the development of the mental diseases of Martin Luther. And this two-volume work here, it was published in 1946. So this is an antiquarian book. It's not easy to get in the bookstores today. Probably it's not possible. It's written in Danish. I'm not quite sure if it's translated, but there are other books with nearly the same content written in German and in English about the psychic disabilities of Martin Luther and the connection between his demonic philosophy and his psychic condition, his diseases. Well, Martin Luther, hans tid, hans personlighed og forudsætninger for hans reformatoriske værk. In English, Martin Luther, his time, his personality, and the preconditions for his reformatory doings. Well, this is the title of this excellent book, and I'm so proud because it's written in Danish, and maybe you can even get it in Danish and get it translated. It's such a fantastic work that it should have been translated. Well, maybe it is, I'm not quite sure, but this is the Danish edition. Book number 2, it is also an old book. It is written in 1916. Well, actually, he had imprimatur. That means the church declares this book being without any faults. There is nothing wrong in this book. It's called The Facts About Luther. The Facts About Luther. And it's a quite voluminous work with 335 pages. And it goes in detail with every aspect of Martin Luther's teaching and life. And these two, the life and the teachings, it's combined. And you will see what is the reason why Martin Luther declared that every Jew must be killed. The Pope must be killed. All workers making uprising or protest against their lords should be killed. All baptized, all Protestant baptizers and all Calvinists, they should be hanged too. Well, Luther, he had the cure against everything: hang them, kill them. But in the end, Martin Luther was only able to kill one person, and probably he should have done that many years before, because it took until 1546 until he hanged himself. And I'll go a little more detailed into how he killed himself, how he took his own life. Well, this is not fantasy from me. We have an eyewitness account. This eyewitness was a devoted follower of Martin Luther. He lived together with Martin Luther the last time of the life of Martin Luther. He was called Ambrosius Cotfeld, and his witness confessions can be read in a book written by Heinrich Sidelius, and this book was published in 1606. Well, you can read it all here. It comes from the internet, but I'll quote the account. I'll quote what Ambrosius Cotfeld, the follower of Luther, what he actually said. He said, the night before his death, Martin Luther was overcome by his habitual imperance and of such excess that we were forced to carry him completely drunk and placed him in his bed. Then we retired to our bedroom. Without sensing anything unpleasant, the next morning we went back to our Lord to help him get dressed as usual. Then, what a tragedy, we saw Mr. Martin hanging miserable from his bed, strangled. His mouth was crooked, his right side of his face was black, his neck was red and misshapen. Well, this is the way that Martin Luther ended his life. You know, it's a big sin for Christians to commit suicide. I believe Martin Luther had the same idea, but he also had the idea that everything you do in this world is sin. God don't care about what you are doing. He only cares about how you're thinking. You know, Martin Luther, he falsified the Bible, took out around 30% of the Old Testament and some parts of the New Testament too. And then he introduced some new words to change the meaning of certain writings in the New Testament. because his idea was that there is no moral in this world. You only have to believe in God, then you are saved. Well, this is not written anywhere in the Bible, but in the Lutheran falsification of the Bible, the Protestant Bibles, and there are maybe 100 different Protestant Bibles just in English. Even in Danish we have 4 or 5 Protestant Bibles. Well, Protestant Bibles are falsifications of the real Bible that was called Vulgata, down when it was published first time in 450. And this is an edition building on the scriptures that Jesus used when he was quoting from Talmud. Well, Martin Luther, he took his life. And the reason he did that was because he saw that his life was a failure. What he had done didn't lead to the result that he wanted, because he said he wanted to reform the Catholic Church, but now he was expelled from the Catholic Church. And a few years later, the 30 Years' War, killing 50% of the population in Germany, it started up. A lot of Calvinists was the majority of the Protestants in Europe. First of all in France, also in Scotland, and from there they went to USA, where they have been the dominating religious force since then. USA is a Protestant Calvinist country. And Calvinism, it is only Lutheranism multiplied with 3. It's even more fantastic than Luther's own teaching, because Calvin, he said that, well, you are predestined, not only one time, as Luther thought, but you are predestined 2 times, even before you are born. God has decided if you're going to heaven or hell. Your own doings in your life will make no change, so moral has no influence on your future destiny in heaven or in hell. Well, Martin Luther's teaching was totally self-contradictory, the opposite of self-evident. It was illogical and immoral. I don't want to go into details about the teaching of Martin Luther, because he contradicted himself all the time. So you really have to read a lot to understand the big picture. But Martin Luther, he took the right conclusion when he knew that he was a failure, him personally. His theology was a failure, and the Reformation was a catastrophe. Since then, the Reformation led to the 30 Years' War. It led to, in wider perspective, to First and Second World War, and to the current tragedy of Europe. We have a lot of different countries in Europe today. This is because of the Reformation, and these countries, they can't agree about much. Therefore, the European Union is just a fiasco, a catastrophe. Martin Luther was a demon. He was maybe one of the worst persons that has been living in Europe. And unfortunately, the people who followed him, that is the kings in Scandinavia and the feudal lords in northern Germany, they had such a possibility to earn a lot of money by stealing the money from the churches. Therefore, they followed the teaching of Martin Luther. Here in Denmark, the Reformation was introduced by an invasion from Germany. For thousands of hired professional soldiers under leadership of a German general called Rantzau, paid by the Danish king. These soldiers, they had big battles against the Danish Catholics in Jutland, in Fyn, and in Skåne. And our main city, Copenhagen, where I am right now, we were under siege from these hired soldiers from Germany for a long time before we had to give up. Well, the Protestant ideology, Lutheranism, was introduced by force. When Denmark was occupied in 1940 by the troops of Adolf Hitler, it was second time the Germans occupied Denmark, second time. And second times was not as awful, not as big as a catastrophe as the first time, because the first time the troops of the Germans, they could find partners here in Denmark to work with, and therefore Protestantism was introduced, and it was the leading ideology for many years. Yeah, still today it is, and therefore all Danes, we are forced to pay money to the Lutheran Church, although we think that Lutheranism is immoral and an anti-religious ideology. It's a disaster for the Danes and, in a wider perspective, for whole Europe. Thank you for listening.